Want to wait 1 minute? You want to get going? I just feel bad when you start.
Hey, let's get this thing started. Ben, can you do me a favor and close the doors? Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the web packaging BOF here at IETF 106. I appreciate everyone showing up. So did we start the blue sheets? Yes. We did start the blue sheets. That's excellent. We already have note takers. Thank you to Lucas Perdue and Martin Duke. That's really great. And Eric Kinnear is going to Jabber Relay, so we don't have to beg everyone for those jobs. So you should thank these fine gentlemen if you should see them in the hallway for sparing you the awkward question. This is the note well. It makes references to various important policies that govern our conduct during this meeting, including the privacy policy and the IPR policy and the code of conduct, which we will be enforcing during this meeting. Okay, so why are we here? I mean, existential questions are important. It's a BOF after all, right? Sean and I are here as your guides. We are neither proponents nor opponents of this proposed working group, and this is a potentially working group forming BOF. The proponents of the BOF have presented a proposed charter and will be sharing their ideas and their technology about the items that are in scope with you directly, as they've already done on the mailing list, and thank you for the discussion that's happened on the mailing list. The high-level purpose of this in-person get-together here, our little confab, is to determine if the BOF participants recommend the formation of a working group based on the web packaging problem that we'll discuss today, and if they do, if they have any recommendations regarding a potential charter for said group. And this will be sort of a long and twisty road to get there, but everything we do is in service of these two questions for the next 90 minutes. All right, here are some of the twists. We'll first be discussing several aspects of the problem space. You see there are 4 really short 5-minute presentations. I'm going to ask that we really hold questions until the end of those when we have a 10-minute period set out for discussion of that. I'm concerned that otherwise there might be a fair bit of redundancy in the questions, and hopefully that'll help avoid some of that. Afterwards, Jeffrey will talk about some of the technology that's being proposed, followed by discussion time specifically about that. Then we'll move on to the proposed charter, gather the group's insights about that proposal. It's been circulated on the mailing list and it's in the meeting materials if you'd like to take a look at it now. We'll also, of course, put it up on the screen when we get to this part. It envisions 5 specific deliverables and proposes a number of specific internet drafts as starting points for a potential working group. If the BOF would like to try and refine that in real time, we can try and do the edit a proposal thing on the screen. I don't know how awesome that will be, but we can give it a shot. And the last thing I want to say before we get on to getting on here is that timing is probably going to be the most important thing that Sean and I do up here today. And it's possible that you'll not be able to finish a presentation, or you'll end up in a queue and it'll get cut off but not get a chance to speak because of the timing, and we'll just have to move on. So my advice is get in line early and keep your presentations on schedule. Additionally, we're going to try and make sure that in particular, the voices of the proponents are heard whenever there's any lack of clarity, because the most important thing here is that you understand their proposal, so we can decide the key questions that we'll ask at the end. And of course, lastly, we will finish with some polls about a potential working group forming BOF. These are the questions at this time that we intend to ask. We'll see if the results of the next 90 minutes alter that in any way. Okay, so with that being said, Matt, you're first.
All right, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name's Matt, and I have just a few brief minutes to talk to you about our use case for web packaging in remote edge networks or community networks. So for some background, I am a researcher at the University of Washington, and I'm here with some of my colleagues. And our research group focuses on internet access in rural, remote, and developing regions. Most typically, we focus on community networks in these regions. So what is a community network? A community network is a network that is owned and operated by members of the community and serving members of the local community. Community networks are generally small scale, and they're typically owned collectively or as a small business, and sometimes even run informally. So 2 key points to take away from this. The first point is that these internet providers are typically too small to have business relationships with typical large content distribution networks or content platforms. The second key point is that these internet providers have local infrastructure that's close to their end users because they're coming from the communities that they're serving. So I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of these networks at a technical level. One is that if you remember, they're extremely remote, and part of coming with being extremely remote in many cases is very constrained backhaul. So I have some numbers from real networks that we operate in, and generally you have on the order of a few megabits per second of backhaul connectivity for a few hundred users. And even these metrics sometimes are a little bit optimistic. But in these networks, we typically have a modern, fast radio access network. And this access network is orders of magnitude faster than the backhaul connection. So even at 1 bar of local signal strength, the bottleneck is still usually the upstream backhaul connection. So in these networks, what does the traffic look like? And we note that in a community, oftentimes the media that people want to share and view is driven by social connections. And these are tightly knit local communities. But we observe that what the network is actually seeing is mostly HTTPS sessions to the large content platforms that you would expect in 2019. So this isn't super surprising. So why are we interested in Webpack? Our goal is to optimize local traffic and keep it off this constrained backhaul connection whenever possible. And this is really complicated to do in the current regime. These networks, again, are too small to locally deploy hardware from major CDNs. And there are some sort of hacky solutions, but they're like really unsatisfying, and they're all like bad in different ways. Right. So 3 concrete use cases to leave you with from community networks that we see. The first is that in these networks, many users disable security updates for their devices because the updates are large and bandwidth is precious. So you can imagine a network administrator's frustration when the same binary has to be downloaded hundreds of times over a backhaul bottleneck. All right, so we see Webpack as a way to cache these updates. The second is local media. Again, I talked about how media sharing is often defined by these local social networks. And we see demand for the same media across many users. And I won't go into this too much because I think there's a presentation about this in more detail later. But the last case I also want to emphasize is breaking out local applications from the content that they're delivering. So if you imagine applications like Trello or Google Docs that are very useful, but that are relatively heavy, they don't operate well in these remote communities. And the members of these communities are cut off from these like important parts of the modern internet. So we see that, we argue that like local caching, even independent of content, could benefit the applications themselves. All right, so our major asks are that we, as a group, consider these small ISPs and drive towards an open standard. And we believe that this is probably the best way forward for us. Right now, to us, Webpack looks like the closest thing available to meet our needs, but we're open to other suggestions also. And we just ask that you all keep this use case in mind. It's not as niche as you may think. So thank you.
Perfect. 11 seconds to spare.
That timing's excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So is Brian going to present remotely, or? All right, so Brian, you can just put yourself in the Meet Echo. Or Brian, I'm sorry, you can't hear me. There you go. Sorry about that. I will admit you and get your slides up. Always easier said than done.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you see the slides?
I can see the slides.
Awesome. So if you want me to advance the slides, just say next.
Okay, so this is going to be really simple, and I'm going to be saying next a lot. Next. Embedded web technologies are increasingly used for embedded systems. This is everything from digital signage to cable boxes to smart appliances, televisions, There are already many hundreds of millions of devices using web browsers for this purpose. You can go to next. They do this because it's a really big commons. It means that you can draw on like millions of developers worldwide with common expertise. And we can all work together on the foundations. So next. The trouble is it's currently a little other. Next. The most straightforward use cases, like basic kiosk things, use the file protocol. Next. Some use cases also use a server, basically local loopback. Next. But the majority of devices are actually really, really resource constrained. These are comparatively very low-end hardware. Next. So that's not very practical to run servers if you don't need to. Ultimately, your embedded device like always comes with at least one application. Like it's supposed to ship with the application, and that application often can't depend on the network for the first load. Okay, next. But you almost always want to update the network when it's available, and it wants to be part of the web, just like everything else. So I'd like to ship you an e-reader with some books already pre-installed, or a cookbook with some recipes. These ultimately exist with real URLs at real endpoints on the real web. And we would like to update them as content changes and things like that. But if we send you your device and you don't have an internet connection at that point in time, you should be able to turn it on and use it usefully. Next. So this is a problem because the web has always assumed your first interaction with the site would come from fetching it from a domain across the internet. And increasingly, many features that are very useful for these sorts of things you get on embedded devices are cut off because they're designed around concepts that really only work with based on the network model. Next. At the same time, the web itself has increased its capabilities to allow it to work increasingly offline. And so it seems that there's just simply a single significant disconnect. Just this assumption that the first content always comes from the online. Next. So the question is, how can we bridge those two worlds? Next. And today, the embedded use cases wind up solving and resolving a lot of complexity to bridge this gap. But what we really want is to simply bootstrap this content into a service worker that is standard fare offline content, and then let all of the web technologies work just as fluidly as they would otherwise. Next. We don't believe that this requires a model of universal trust and signing. What we need is a uniform way to configure a specific device or browser startup to say, trust this package as this. It's not important that other browsers and devices all also share the same level of trust, because with an embedded device, we're giving you an entire operating system, and we can reasonably say what you trust. I believe that's the end of my slides. Oh, it's not. So this leaves it, if we solve this, it means no local web servers are necessary, and there's no discrepancy like, is it the web or isn't it the web? Is it this strange relationship? Then it's just a standard offline web app. Yes. So the ability to provide my disk image, a package with a service worker, and just load it and go.
So that was kind of fun. It was like Pekka Hucha slides just kept running no matter what.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. If you,
Thank you.
want to get into the discussion during the discussion time, just jump right back in the queue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Devin is gonna speak next, and then Kanuku after that.
Okay. Hello, I'm Devin from Google. And I need to figure out how to use this thing. Hello. So what led to AMP in the first place? This is a bit of prehistory for me because I joined AMP just last year to work on sign exchanges. But as far as I can tell, people saw the mobile web was suffering, and kind of motivations to heal that come from a variety of places. It's an amalgam of the individuals working on the project, those that founded it and kind of set cultural precedent, as well as the companies participating in the project, which the motivations there is amalgams as well. There are many possible avenues for improvement of the mobile web, and AMP is one of many that Google has pursued over the years. The why AMP in particular? As far as I can tell, there's kind of two main goals here. One is to enable good UX at scale through opinionated DX, and the other is to enable static verification of a variety of properties. Here's the UX properties, security and privacy, which I'll talk about on the next slide, and as well as a communication channel between the referrer and the referent to enable certain interaction patterns. So why the AMP cache? One is to enable this static analysis, and another one is predictably fast page loading, which if you're looking for like a 95 percentile metric, it doesn't strictly require a cache, but it helps. And once you've made the decision to have a cache kind of then leads to this chain of implications, which requires these particular privacy and security guarantees. Consequence of this is bad URLs, which leads to bad branding, wasted screen real estate, having to trust caches, and difficulty or impossibility using a variety of web APIs because the bad origin means that the AMP cache has access to state it doesn't want, and pages have to do extra work to send that back to the publisher, for instance, using cores. Sign exchanges fix all of that while still allowing AMP to guarantee the sort of the UX privacy and security guarantees that were set by the initial unsigned AMP deployment. This is my attempt to sort of distill our minimal needs. One is that the content should provide the URL in origin in a way that the browser can trust for display to the user as well as for those web APIs. Another is that the publisher should be able to specify a subset of the page that up to and including the whole page in a way that can render concurrently with additional network requests for resources. Third, the user experience should be relatively unimpacted in the event of certain distribution errors. And lastly, because this is kind of based on the sign exchange spelling, I may have over and under specified in ways that we'll discover as we explore the design space. In the future, there's room for Google's deployment of the current spec, and we're working on all of these. So caches cannot distribute modified versions of signed exchanges to users, publisher signed exchanges to users, but they can serve previously fetched signed exchanges within the expires window. This is mostly an improvement on the unsigned AMP model. The mitigations here are not full solutions because they are subject to aggregator approval as well as possible interference from high-level actors that can selectively block traffic. AMP signed exchanges need to vary by distributor. This is the AMP cache transform header that some people have heard of. This is mostly due to the fact that these were deployed before the multi-exchange solutions were designed and built, and the sort of our non-AMP solution, non-AMP signed exchange solution shouldn't have this problem, and hopefully we can fix this for AMP as well. Lastly, various companies, including Google, require AMP for certain experiences. This should be generalizable to a much wider subset of the web. And outside of this BOF, Google is working on evolving various standards to make that possible and welcomes participation in that space. Thank you.
Covered a lot of material in 5 minutes. Thank you for that. The clock management of this presentation is very good, if nothing else. Kanuko, will you be joining us remotely? If so, just put yourself in the Meet Echo queue and I can hit the red button.
Hello.
You have the floor. Can you see your slides?
Yes, thanks. Can you
So
hear me?
just say next and I will advance your slides when you want.
Okay, sure. So let me just start. Hello, I'm Kiniko from Google. I'm basically working on Chrome and have been implementing web packaging feature. Next, please. So I'd like to talk about use case sharing unsigned bundles. The unsigned bundles are basically, bundles without signatures. Because they're bundles, they can bundle up multiple resources like HTML, JavaScript, images, or fonts, and they can represent a single or multiple pages. Users can just open a bundle and they can browse around within the bundle, and they even can execute JavaScript. While because it doesn't have signatures, it is not possible to verify who published the content or if the content is the same as the original. Next, please. And here's the potential use case. Imagine that the browsers provide a feature like Save as Bundle, where users can basically casually download the current page that users browsing and share it with friends. In order to do so, browser can automatically generate a bundle for the page, or sites can probably also craft their own bundle for better UX and provide a link tag so that the browser can discover and they can download it instead. Next, please. And the features like this could enable, for example, like in a situation where internet connectivity is limited, maybe on an airplane, your friend might have downloaded a nice web game as a bundle. And because it's a bundle, this just works offline. Next, please. But then you set to physical, you want to also try the web app while you play the game. But with bundles, it's simple. You can basically get the bundle using a P2P file transfer. You just basically turn on the launch the app for next page, and then get the bundle file from your friend's device. Next, please, and then open it. Then the game or website just works in a browser. Next, please. By the way, this example scenario actually works with latest Chrome canary if you enable the particular flag for the web bundles. I've uploaded an unsigned bundle here for a web game so that you can actually try it out if you are interested. And I can share it with friends as well. Next, please. I didn't explicitly mention, but of course, because bundle can bundle up multiple resources and the resources can be loaded from there, users themselves can use that for offline browsing. And because resources can be just there, it loads very fast, regardless of the connectivity. Next, please. And so offline or flaky network situations is still very common in my feeling. It was actually also mentioned in previous talks. But for example, in some buildings or some public transportation systems, you probably have experienced that a Wi-Fi or mobile coverage very flaky. Or actually, in some cases, mobile carriers sometimes put very heavy throttling when users data reaches a limit. And once it happens, getting anything from the server, from the network, becomes very, very painful. And it actually can be very commonly observable in Japan. Next, please. And also, for example, Alliance for Affordable Internet publishes Internet Affordability Report every year. And the latest report, which was just published last month, still says that billions of people around the world are kept offline. And among these people, public Wi-Fi and P2P file transferring is very, very common. Next, please. And today there are open source tools available on GitHub so that the developers can kind of easily create their bundles for their site. Next, please. So in summary, we think that I think that the unsigned bundles can be very useful for casual saving share cases, and the bundled page can just work even while offline. So we think this technology could be very useful for this kind of cases.
Thank you so much. Okay. So thank you to all the presenters for summarizing the use cases and problems that they anticipate would be solved by the efforts in this working group. We have 10 minutes set aside now to talk about those use cases, keeping in mind that afterwards, Jeffrey will make a presentation about his sort of the proposed approaches of technologies he has for the potential working group. If any of the speakers would like to come forward, Jeffrey as well, to help facilitate this discussion, that's fine, or points of clarification. Mark, go.
Yes, Mark Nottingham. I was a little surprised. So it's being asserted that the use cases we just heard about are all in scope for the proposed work and will be delivered by it.
Yes.
That was a long pause, but yes. So I see a very clear path from what has been proposed to the AMP use case, and that's fine. I don't see a clear path or a natural reason why this work is the right solution for the other use cases. For the unsigned bundling, why is a standard format for this necessary? Browsers already do this to some degree. I'd expect to hear about interoperability challenges in that area. For the remote network and the poorly connected networks, this is a problem we've talked about a lot in the HTTP working group. We've had proposals in this space in the past, and we didn't go forward for a lot of different reasons. But part of that is that when you do that, you lose confidentiality. And so it makes me a little nervous to say we're going to address this use case when we don't have an answer to the confidentiality problem and we don't have a rendezvous mechanism for finding those caches. There's a lot of undone work there. So I'd almost want to say don't include that in scope for the charter, but maybe that's, if we find a path towards that, then do that later.
Ted Hardy. That actually turns out to be something that Daniel Kahn-Gilmore raised as an issue with me and Brian some time ago, and we actually went out and did an analysis. I think you're right, it is much more complicated. As it turns out, the first use case where you're basically replacing the connection to a distributor replaces the connection to an origin, it ends up looking a lot like, in sort of your mental model, the connection to a CDN replacing the connection to an origin. In peer-to-peer networks, it's somewhat different because you have two different ways of trying to manage the confidentiality property. And I'll give you the simplest way of thinking about it. In a flooding network, this isn't a problem because every node sees every question and every response. And so the size of the flooding network turns out to be the equivalent of the anonymity size of the group you have. Now, no peer-to-peer network in the modern sense is a flooding network. But if you start from that and think about, okay, what I actually need to do is to obfuscate which client is asking the question. There are actually techniques you can use for this that basically create pseudo clients and say that the client that is sending it is claiming to be on path to the client which is making the request, rather than being the requester itself. And the result of that is, as long as you're able to manufacture those kind of pseudo client mechanisms, and this is actually something Bundle allows you to do very easily, but some others like RightsMesh or other peer-to-peer technologies don't allow you to do easily, you can get there. Now, is this worked enough to put into a standard right now? Absolutely not. But I think there are paths for which we can take this analysis, and that there's a reasonable sense in which one or the other would allow us to move forward with the peer-to-peer cases. So, that's frankly the one that interests me the most.
So we're going to cut the queue after Brian, really quick.
Okay, that sounds exciting, but I'd like to see the proposal so we can analyze it before we consider it in scope for this work, and especially not only the security analysis, but the analysis of whether this is the right framework to fit that approach within.
Right. So in particular, the work on the peer-to-peer protocol is not in the charter. It's only the thing that you transfer And the way the community networks, I believe, would use it is they would have a central node that users explicitly go to fetch the applications,
Okay.
so the privacy is explicit.
And we have 20 minutes to debate the charter as well. Philip?
Philhan Baker. I'm really puzzled by the set of use cases because as I was watching them and thinking, well, of course you want encryption. I just can't understand why you're proposing a packaging format without encryption in the first place. I can't see why with those use cases you don't want encryption. Because if you're doing any cache data in the network, cache data should be encrypted. I don't think that today we should be talking about deploying a new bunch of web technology that assumes that the data sits even on a web server unencrypted. And now you're wanting to throw this data all over in caches everywhere and not think about encryption. I think that encryption should be a requirement.
Roberto?
I'm still Roberto. Thank you. Facebook.
Shut up.
If our intent is to ensure that we can offline some applications or speed up some of the offline, speed it up so that we can use offline resources, would this only include HTTP, or are we imagining that we could extend this as well to some of the other APIs like WebSockets that are fairly common within the pages? So the reason I ask this right now is because it may change how we define this problem if we are going to charter it.
Hi, Mallory Nodal from Article 19. Just a clarifying question on Brian's presentation. It said on the future slide, working on making AMP a requirement for various integrations. Are you making it a requirement? You're making it not a requirement? Yeah, totally.
So it is presently a requirement for various cases. The goal is to make it not a requirement. There is going to be a requirement, but the goal is to widen that to much more of the web.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm glad it's not the other thing. And then I had just a comment about, I think the community networks case is super interesting, and I think it should go beyond a humble request to consider it as a use case. I actually think that in a lot of ways, if you actually start from the experience and the use case of a community network, you will get much further than thinking about like the intermediary needs, which is what AMP and News and all the other ones are. Because there's really three people playing here, and depending on their perspective, you would probably get a different technology. There's the original publisher, there's then the end user, and then there's the intermediary. And right now, all these technologies are coming from an intermediary's perspective, and I feel like we could get a very different result if we start with community networks in that current reality. So just, I guess, hope that that's the focus and not a side issue.
Yeah, and in fact, the design did start from the idea of the community networks, and we later realized that it worked for AMP too.
Thank you.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, ACLU. So I continue to be nervous about this. I appreciate Ted's comment about in response to Mark Nottingham. But I wanted to point out there was a couple weird things that happened in the exchange just between Mark and Ted there. Mark came up here and said, we really need to think about confidentiality. And Ted came up and said, well, we did this analysis thinking about basically metadata privacy. And those two are not the same thing. So one question, and maybe this is also related to Phil's comment, but so one question is, how much should the intermediary be able to see of the content? And then the second question is, how much should the intermediary be able to see of what the user actually does? And the fact that those two things are being bundled together worries me. And the fact that that we are now conflating authenticity with the origin and all of the other pieces of whatever the origin means in the browser also worries me, because I think as we talked about last time, there's a lot of things that the origin means in the web today. And I'm not convinced that we actually know what all of those things are and what we're going to be doing with it. So I'm just going to repeat that particular concern because I don't think that those questions have been answered in a robust way. I don't even know how to answer them because the web is so big. So I'm just like trying to put those concerns back on the table. I also want to add one quick thing, which is when we're thinking about this stuff, the web security model is a transport security model. This is an object security model. I have no problem with object security models. The DNSSEC is object security. OpenPGP is object security. CMS is object security. But that's not the web security model.
You will see this question later.
Okay.
So just for clarity, Ted is part of the proponents for the BOF, so I'm going to give him a chance to clarify if he wants there.
So I appreciate the comment. I was actually going to ask you a clarifying question, which is why I got up there so quickly, but you got to the end before I did. And that is when you're asking in particular, what can the intermediary see of what the user does? Can you unpack that slightly?
Sure. So with the transport model that we know and love on the web, the intermediary, well, I suppose there are, link tracking JavaScript and things like that. But once the user has navigated away from the referrer basically doesn't get to see anything else, right? In terms of what the user is concretely doing when they interact with the origin. In the model where the intermediary just keeps themselves there and acts as a proxy for the content, they see all of the transactions between the client and the origin.
So in this particular case, you're thinking intermediary equals distributor of the bundle, right?
That's right, or or bundles, right?
Or bundles,
because
indeed,
they may be able to extract piecemeal, right? So if the only thing that they get is one bundle from the origin, then presumably they ship the entire bundle. That will probably make the small networks sad because that's it. The bundle is large and they're now forced to pay that cost, even if the user is only looking at one element of the bundle. If the bundle is split up into detail and the user requests the different bundles separately, then you get finer grained details about what the user actually is doing.
Okay, so we can probably take a detailed discussion of this offline, but I agree with you that you have to think about this in a slightly different way here. So an example that was given in later slides is the weekly digest that gets handed around Cuba. It's actually fairly large as a bundle of information, but the peer-to-peer handing of it around is very, very cheap. So the backhaul portion of it, the generation and the backhaul of it is the expensive part, both from a true cost perspective and frankly, in the past, a political risk perspective, right? So if you're handing that off as a whole, in fact, the intermediary doesn't know anything about what you're interested in within that about
right. So the larger, less coarse-grained bundle,
and so
the better.
It's sort of like picking a DNS query provider. You can hide your query stream and everybody else's query stream if you get a big one, but now you're talking to somebody who's a big query provider. You have the same sort of thing when you're talking about the size of object you as a content creator create.
Yep.
And so one of the things that the content creators have to think about is what they're putting together in a bundle. Is it enough to have the user experience set that their likely users are going to want to have in the context that they want? Frankly, I think AMP is the simple version of this set of considerations, right? It's much harder in the peer-to-peer cases, but I think, again, it's both worth doing and should be the motivating use case for some of the security and privacy considerations that we end up writing.
Okay, yeah. We're gonna have to wrap up this section of the program at this point, but we have a chance for more discussion coming up later.
Can I just want to point out one quick detail about
the last
this.
word, but please keep it under 20 seconds.
So the person distributing the bundle is the origin, and they are making decisions in terms of how they pack up the bundle, which will have an impact on the privacy characteristics for the client with respect to the intermediary. So the incentives about who's making these decisions and who's getting affected by them are pretty weird.
So we'll move on. Jeffrey's going to talk about some of the proposed technologies potentially that would be in the working group.
Yep. So I'll start this by saying all of this is preliminary. We expect this to change possibly in significant ways as the working group does its work. And there's a piece of the design that's intended to facilitate that. So this is in two sections. One is the package or bundle format. The other is talking about origin trust. So a package is a collection of URLs, possibly from multiple origins, with content negotiation information. So this example has one URL that's negotiated on language, one that's negotiated on content type, and one that's not negotiated and comes from a different origin than the other two. The overall format in the current design, it's the subset of CBOR without tags, without complicated map keys, and without floating point. There's a chunk at the beginning of the format that we hope to be invariant, which has the version number and a fallback URL, so that a client that doesn't understand the version it gets can just redirect to that URL. There's a list of sections so that the format can be used in a random access way. There's an index of those sections, so pointers directly to where they start, so that it can be used, so that it can be read in a streaming way. We put that index at the beginning of the format, unlike zip, which puts it at the end. This sacrifices the ability to append resources and the ability to write the format in a streaming way. And then at the very end, we stick the total length of the format so that we can stuff it into self-extracting executables. The index section is a map from a URL and content negotiation information to a range of bytes in the responses section. The content negotiation information currently uses Mark Nottingham's variance proposal. The responses section is just a big chunk of HTTP responses. The index points at an individual response, so you never have to parse the whole section at once. You just parse the thing you want to look up. A response is represented as the pair of header and body. The header is a map from names to values. We don't represent trailers right now, and we assume that header fields have been combined, which means that we can't represent set cookie or multiple set cookies. As far as I know, that's the only header that breaks in this model, and we could change it if people think it's important to bundle set cookie. The manifest gives you a pointer, it gives you a URL for some metadata about the package, and that URL is expected to be found within the package. For a web app, it's probably the app manifest defined by the W3C. For a book, it might be the EPUB index format or manifest format. It's not specified exactly what it needs to be. That'll be in the kind of W3C side of the specifications. There's a list of critical sections. So the section names are an extensibility point. And so if we define a new section and it's important that clients read it or don't use the package, then it gets listed in the critical sections. And there's a couple other ways to represent this if we think this isn't the right detailed way. And finally, there's a list of signatures for stuff in the bundle. So the signature section has a list of authorities. An authority is a X509 certificate. It could be a raw public key. We could define other things that are authorities. Raw public keys are useful for a signature-based sub-resource integrity, where a web page just says, here's the public key I expect to have signed my resource. An X509 certificate could represent a domain owner or something else. For instance, a transparency log asserting that a resource appeared in it. Could be kind of semantically a publisher of books that vouch for the content but don't say this lives at a particular origin. And the list needs to include any certificates used to build a chain to a trusted root, because these are meant to be used offline. Each signature picks out a signing authority. The type of public key determines the signature algorithm. It defines when in time the signature is valid, start and end. It points at a URL where you can update the signature. So once it expires, you can get a new version, assuming the content hasn't changed. And it covers a particular subset of resources. So you can have resources from multiple origins which need different signers. And so you pick out the particular subset that this signature is vouching for. Signs the hashes of the resource using Martin Thompson's MICE algorithm, again, to help with streamed loading. We don't have a design yet for counter signatures, but there's a couple use cases that seem like they need them. So that's something that I would suggest the working group think about. When you have a package that has untrusted stuff in it, so stuff that's not signed, each resource has a package URL and an origin that it's claiming. Now we need that to be cross-origin with stuff that is actually from the origin that's claimed. Otherwise, you get trivial cross-site scripting. Resources with a different claimed origin and same package need to be cross-origin so that storage works. If you bundle two different websites into one package, like El Paquete Semanal does in Cuba, you don't want their storage to stomp on each other. Things on the server that served the package should be cross-origin with the package. This supports the web archive, which bundles a bunch of websites that it doesn't trust and doesn't want them to be able to mess with the main origin. And then we think that you should be able to package the same resource into two packages, like two versions of a resource into two packages, and have them not stomp on each other's storage. So origin trust is the controversial part of all this, as far as I can tell. Fundamentally, you get origin trust by signing the content with a certificate that's issued the same way as a server's TLS certificate. All of the complicated parts come from trying to prevent a group of dangers that come from that signing. So some of those dangers are intrinsic to any object-based security model. Some we can avoid by designing things carefully. So for the intrinsic dangers, we can kind of make them less dangerous. We can't completely prevent them. And so we make servers opt into the danger. They do that by having the certificate have a particular X509 extension, and then CAs only grant that if DNS says to. We also limit the length that the signature can be valid, so that if someone signs a vulnerability and thinks that they don't have a vulnerability, they still can't shoot themselves in the foot forever. The particular limit of a week is pretty arbitrary, and the working group should reconsider it. You can cause problems if you sign personalized data. So if you sign someone's bank statement, you can allow them to attack other people. We have some advice in the specifications about how servers can prevent themselves from doing that in a kind of systematic way. And then clients also do not allow stateful headers. So you can't do session fixation stuff. That comes from some comments that Ecker and Martin Thompson sent. If you just have a bundle of signed things, then an attacker could mismatch versions. That's why the bundles have signatures that cover multiple resources at once. If an attacker removes one resource from the signed group, it requests for it from the stuff in the bundle will fail. They won't go to the network. But if you try to fetch something that's not mentioned at all, it will go to the network, which helps a couple use cases. John Willender from Safari pointed out that if a distributor knows a user ID, they can send it to the origin that signed the package, which allows tracking, and we don't want to do that. And so we're going to require that you request a package without credentials, and that the distributor's URL is a function of the primary URL in the package. That prevents the source from encoding a user ID into the URL. There may be more dangers. We haven't fully analyzed the web security model, and we're going to need to. And so the working group's charter includes instructions to look into this and publish documents analyzing what the full implications are. So I've talked a bunch about packages. You heard stuff about signed exchanges earlier. Signed exchanges are basically an optimized format for a one resource bundle that's signed. We're not sure if we will actually need that optimization in the long run. If we don't, all of the tools that generate signed exchanges will just migrate to generating bundles. And that's it.
Thank you. We have a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes, actually, to talk about this presentation. So any questions, comments, general observations about the technology? Mics are open.
Roberto Peon, Facebook. Well, when there is a bundle and one resource is changed, and we wish to have that one changed item available for everybody else, how will we accomplish that?
It is it's reasonable to build a patch format. We haven't done that. And it's not currently in the working group charter, but I'm not opposed to saying that the working group should think about that.
Right.
I think it's a secondary consideration. I think we should possibly think about it in designing the primary format to make it possible, but I don't think we need to kind of have the patch format fully figured out before we get use out of the bundles.
I think that it's a question. So stepping back, the question I'm trying to ask is this something, if we formed a working group, would that be in scope of that working group? Because it might be an important tool for solving some of the use cases that we had presentations about at the beginning of the meeting. Thanks.
Martin Thompson. I was wondering if how many people in this room had read the Escape Workshop report? This is probably relevant here. All right, that's pretty good. All of these problems were discussed there, and we went through a bunch more discussion about the use cases, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood this. I think the unsigned bundles aspect of this work is interesting. Tying it so completely to HTTP may be a decision that our working group could make a decision on. It seems a little bit odd in some ways, the way that it's structured at the moment. I sort of understand how it got there and the form of it, but the fact that you don't have request header fields is curious, which requires that you understand the variance thing very, very much in depth before you can satisfy yourself that this is an okay thing to do.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that it would be possible to add request headers that are matched literally into the content negotiation information.
Yeah, but most of my reservations about this work, and I think many others, is about this notion of taking the content that you have acquired from any distribution channel, and you've identified one problem with the use of those distribution channels, and then substituting that in for content that would be considered equivalent to and can share the same state as stuff that you would acquire from a direct connection to the origin. And I haven't seen, to DKG's points earlier, a satisfactory answer to that makes me comfortable that we have the answer in that area. And that remains my biggest concern with all of this. Unfortunately, that goes to a lot of the use cases that we're talked about. I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah, it goes to half of the use case talks that were here.
Yeah, I think there's half of it, and when you draw a bright line down the middle of it, you suddenly realize that the space of use cases that we have here is a little bit more diverse than a single solution might address. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the spectrum of use cases. I got cut off before, but I think this is probably a comment that a concern that I share with Mark Nottingham and others.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to cut the queue in just a brief moment, so if you want to get in, jump up now.
Hi, Brian Trammell, Google. So this is not a fully formed thought, but kind of as a response to Martin. I also I think that the encoding parts of this are uninteresting, which is to say, good job, looks good, seems reasonable, yay. The interesting question here is, again, this shift from transport to object security. I see in sort of the encoding parts of this presentation a lot of evidence of essentially, hey, we have this, we have some implementation experience with it, we took it to a larger forum, we basically got feedback, and you're essentially playing sort of like vulnerability golf with the format. DKG and Ted and I sat down in Montreal after this and sort of tried to start playing that game with the transport to object security stuff. And I thought we got a lot farther than I expected us to get, right? Like, so the space kind of got bigger, but it didn't get, exponentially bigger in a way that was terrifying. At least from my standpoint, DKG is kind of making a face over there that makes me think that maybe we're having a slightly different conversation. I think the approach that was applied to sort of the encoding and sort of the interactions is probably one that we should apply to the transport to object security thing. Like, continue having these discussions in larger fora, because it's like, I don't think that the solution to this should be that Ted, DKG, and I sit down and have a beer and talk about it, right? Like, we need a bigger room to do that. And I know that we're not supposed to be talking to the charter point yet, so I'm going to shut up.
That would be the point of the working group.
Thank you.
To expand it beyond
exactly.
here. So the line's going to be cut after our JavaScript.
And but I will make that point back again about like how to massage the charter to say, you know, this is where
we got time set aside for the charter discussion.
Philhan Baker. Yeah, I do have some very firm views about encoding because I have an alternative proposal here. But that aside, I think that one of the things that we need to do here is, it's not just, when you choose use cases, it's not just about choosing the use cases that you want to solve. It's about finding the paradigmatic use case that encapsulates as much of the problem as possible. And what you're doing here is that you're moving from transport, which HTTP is, to the object. What you're really doing here is that this package is really standing for that web server that you're not talking to. And so when you're trying to map it onto HTTP, which, you know, I'm a big fan of HTTP, you know, I did some work on it myself at one point. I think that what you need to do is to think in terms of, if you were going to have a format that would allow a website manager to upload their content into the cloud and service from just that format. I know that is not one of the use cases that you want to consider, but I think that that might be the paradigmatic use case that would guide the design in a profitable way.
So you made the really interesting point that you can think of this package format as acting as the server. And I think it actually acts as the cache, which is why variants happened to work really well for it. And if you think of the package as a cache, it actually probably does work for CDN upload. But the paradigmatic use case that I've been coming from for designing the whole thing is in fact the community networking use case.
Mark Nottingham. Since Martin brought it up, I helped instigate the Escape workshop, and from my perspective, that was largely because we had heard concerns from parts of the community about the power dynamics around you know, whether this would enable certain imbalances. And I think my takeaway from that was that while those are concerning dynamics, it's not something that we should really concern ourselves with here, because it's an effect at least a tertiary distance. It's not a direct effect of this proposal. And so to my mind, those criticisms aren't valid for this proposal. It's not something we should say, well, we can't do that work here. If there were a direct effect, of course, you know, that's a different story. And so I'm not against this work going forward. I do have concerns. I'm going to piss off Patrick. Can we go back to the slides? I know you've got the charter up now.
Which slides? The
Jeffrey's slides. Yes. And go back a couple. Not quite that fast, geez. Forward a few, please. Keep on going.
Give me something to work with, Mark. What am I looking for?
One more. No, keep on going. Keep on going.
What are you looking
maybe
for?
not. I'll do it from memory. How's that? You know, you mentioned at one point that there's a risk when you put private data in the package.
Yes.
And the kind of hand wave the answer to that is well, publisher don't do that. You know, we have an analogous situation in Thank you. You know, we have an analogous situation in HTTP where we have a lot of people who want to do shared compression for state on different representations, and it's very exciting for a lot of people. But we've consistently told them no, because the security properties of that are too slippery and it's a foot gun. And we've created this requirement that community interested in that create a quite complex document around the security trade-offs there. We need to evaluate that, and then we'll think about starting some work. Yet here, you know, I think some of the same engineers who did that evaluation of no, we can't do that, have said, oh, this is okay. We need to take these things seriously. We need to have that evaluation. So I'd like to see that. Another aspect of this that concerns me is I was on the tag when the tag did the original package format that you started with and have since gone way beyond. And one of the concerns around that is that developers tend to overuse packages, and I'm concerned we're going to get to a web where we're back to PDFs or Flash applications where you do a huge chunky download. You don't get good cache efficiency. You don't get good integration into the stack. And so, people say this is an alternative to HTTP, but it also needs to work with HTTP. You say it's part of the caching model. It needs to work with the HTTP caching model, and we need to have those discussions too.
And our Jabber relay gets the last word.
Chris Lemon says on Jabber, this work seems designed directly for the Google AMP presentation. The other use cases appear to be trying to pick up on a solution that seemed to solve 80% of their use case. The question is really whether we want to take on those extra 20% of work. He thinks we should start with the basic work, and if we discover that we want to and can expand the scope, that we would consider rechartering at that time.
Ted Hardy, and I'm doing the proponent response to this because I could read what he wrote and work Jeffrey couldn't. And there are kind of two responses I have, one of which is, as a proponent, you would make Jeffrey and I very, very sad if you left these out, because there's a really use cases we care a lot about. And Mallory and others have kind of pointed out why those might be good paradigmatic use cases. But the other reason is actually an IETF reason. And as the IETF does its best work when it's building building blocks. And if you have something really, really tailored in mind when you build the building block, it's not a very good building block for anything else. So simply having these other use cases in mind, not only do we get to use them in these important community network applications if we get them right, it's going to make the building block better even for the AMP use case. So I strongly believe that the charter should include more than one use case here, and I prefer to include the AMP and the community network one as just very basic.
Yeah, I think so. Now we're going to move to the fun part where hopefully nothing crashes. And I brought the right dongle, and this all works. The big Google Apple transfer, see if this works. Come on, Scruffy, here we go. Do I have all my other applications closed? No. Yeah, I turned that off.
Patrick, I'm sorry, can I ask a very quick question because I was busy scribing? Would the historical archiving use case apply to this? Maybe it's a yes or no question. Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we're going to have some reading, hopefully. Where the hell did this thing go? Come on, Scruffy. I think I've done this before in my life. Why won't it slide over? That's annoying. All right, what am I doing wrong? Usually you just... Sorry.
Is it live? We can pull it here. You can still do that.
Yeah, this is the blog one. Why the fuck would it pull over there? There it is. No, did it. Stupid thing. There, I'll just plug it back in over here. Sorry, I think we fixed it. Apologies again.
While you do this, can I finish the thought, or are you done? Oh, there you go. Never mind.
Or maybe not. What the fuck? I do not understand why it's not working. I'm completely baffled. Yeah, plug it back in over there. Okay. Yeah.
So I forgot one part of my comment, which was, I think it's super important for everyone here, especially folks who have specific use cases in mind, to realize that this is a building block. Ted's absolutely correct. And that the parts we're going to deliver are just building blocks that need to be implemented and enabled by other places. So browsers need to expose APIs. And some use cases may be advantaged by that, and some may not be realized. Likewise, we talk about rendezvous, we talk about other things. It won't happen unless we actually have other standards and other bodies created and then implemented.
All right, so now this is the fun part where we get to do some group editing. So I guess go ahead and start reading. Roberto, are you going to the microphone? No, okay. So background. Ben, are you getting in line? Yeah, go ahead. I mean, you might as well. Yeah, my plan was basically just to read this and try to take comments, and literally, if we can edit it on the fly. We have 20 minutes set aside for this. No, it's more like 10 now since I screwed up for 5, but hey.
If you're starting from the beginning, then I'm going to
Yes.
have to wait.
Okay, so background. Web pages sometimes group multiple sub-resources into a single combined resource to allow cross-resource compression and to reduce the overhead of HTTP1 requests. W3C tag proposed a web packaging format based on multi-part to give web browsers visibility into the structure of these combined resources. That has not seen deployment, and HTTP2 did not make these bundles unnecessarily as was once expected. These bundles are still needed in countries where expensive and or unreliable mobile data. There is established practice of sharing content in native applications peer-to-peer. Untrusted web content can generally be shared, but within the web's move to HTTPS, it is no longer possible to share web apps over these channels. I will pause there. Yes.
Martin Thompson, that last statement is false.
Okay. It is.
There's an implicit assumption here that the web application is identified by an HTTPS URI or some such, I think. And so it might need a little bit of expansion if you want to keep that one. I just realized that now. It's like, oh, hang on a second. Web applications can come from other places as well.
Mark Nottingham. Excuse me, Mark Nottingham. The last sentence of the first paragraph is going to be read by many developers as saying that bundling is necessary for performance. That's an extremely contentious and I think disproven statement in the web performance community. I'd recommend deleting it.
Mike Bishop, there's a statement here that a previous attempt to solve this problem was not deployed. And we don't go into why it was not adopted or how we intend to do better. That needs to at least be understood. Maybe research on that as part of the working group's charter, but I think I would rather have an understanding of that before we go to a working group.
Okay.
So answering Martin, the browsers require a secure context for a lot of web app APIs now. You don't get that with files. And replying to Mark, there's a program called Webpack, which we're trying not to collide names with, but that is super heavily used, sometimes too much. If you listen to Alex Russell, like bundle sizes should be smaller, but we do not know how to send the individual resources efficiently. You have to bundle them to get reasonable performance.
More charter. Roberto.
Roberto Peon. So I bound this off at least two folks that agree that this is not crazy. So hopefully this is not crazy, but a lot of the solution space and problem space of this are very similar to those things we tried to attack with HTTP2 server push. And I think that's probably worth thinking about, or maybe even a mention here, because these things are so similar. Like, oh my gosh, it's already in the cache, I'm going to push it again. Is that going to prevent me from making this bundle, et cetera, et cetera? It's endemic. It's so similar.
So would it work to change that to HTTP2 server push instead of just HTTP2? That might be a little more clear.
I'd like to make an observation that we're wordsmithing the background section.
I know. Let's get to
I'm just making that observation because I'd like to talk about the rest of it.
All right,
We can
let's
take some
do
time on
that.
that.
Patrick took notes on the sides, and we can, try to resolve these on the list. So WPACK. The WPACK working group will develop a specification for a web packaging format that efficiently bundles multiple HTTP resources. It will also specify a way to optionally sign these resources such that a user agent can trust that they came from their claimed web origins. Key goals for Webpack are efficient storage across a range of resource combinations. 3 examples to be supported are client generated snapshot of a complete web page, a web page's tree of JavaScript modules, and El Paquete from Cuba. I'm sure I butchered that.
Yeah, Ben Schwartz. As much as I love El Paquete Semanal, can we just not have that as our specific example, since a complete web page doesn't say yahoo.com?
I could take that point. We can just say 2. All right. Safe web app installation after having been retrieved from a peer. Low latency to load a sub-resource from a package, whether the package is signed or unsigned, and whether the package is streamed, loaded from a random access storage.
Can I make a comment on something that you haven't read out yet?
No, because Roberto's in line.
Is web app installation well defined enough that, are we invoking a liaison relationship here, or it seems to be a little messy?
Installation is the.
Okay. The next one is being extensible, including to avoid cryptography that becomes obsolete. Security and privacy properties using bundles as close to as practical to TLS 1.3 transport of the same resources. Where properties do change, the group will document exactly what changed and how the content authors can compensate.
Hi, Brian Trammell, Google. I understand where this came from. I understand that a lot of the anxiety around this is about that last part right there. I would like anyone affected by any change in the security model to be able to compensate, and I'd like us to consider all of them. So like either I can suggest text for that, either expanding it or contracting it, right? Like, but don't leave it right there.
Scribe interrupt. Can you repeat your point about liaison?
Whether the web app installation was sufficiently understood, and if we're instituting essentially a liaison relationship with the W3C.
Thank you.
Mm.
How are you going to remember things for me?
Ted Hardy, I think the security and privacy properties of using bundles after Daniel Kahn-Gilmour's previous discussion is probably not granular enough. We need to have both something here that talks about the retrieval of the bundles and the confidentiality properties of using the bundle-derived resources as well. And since I see him behind me in line, I'll let him finish this off.
Basically just needs more details. My super high-level summary of that.
I would suggest also that so one of the headings from Jeffrey's slides about the transition from transport to object security might show up in here and be a good way to shorthand a little bit of that.
The currently highlighted text does not seem specific enough or comprehensive enough. I will leave it to others to expound.
Mike Bishop, I want to make sure that one of the notes back further up, it was very brief and I think it misses the point that was made. The suggestion was not to drop on El Paquete Semanal, was not to drop the third example, but I interpreted that as drop that particular embodiment and just refer to the use case.
Can you collapse the outline so we can see the comments?
Yes, I should be able to do that.
Simply saying,
there we go. Look at that.
Yeah, simply saying to drop the third one does not capture that suggestion.
Yep, there we go. Thank you for doing that on the fly for me. Yes. So a low likelihood that the new format increases centralization or power imbalances on the web.
So, sorry, this is Daniel Kahn-Gilmour. So the one that's highlighted there, and I can't tell what's going on now. I don't know how people work with white on white.
I'm trying to make you seasick.
In addition to maybe being too vague, it seems basically impossible to me. The TLS 1.3 transport is going away if we do this, right? The confidentiality and privacy properties that you get from TLS 1.3 are simply not present when someone else is doing the delivering of the data. And so the idea that we're trying to keep it as close as practical just sounds like a flight of fancy to me. And I can't imagine how we would do that.
Are you suggesting a bar the work would have to meet to be successful with respect to that?
Sorry?
Are you suggesting a bar that the work would have to meet rather than
I'm saying
documenting sort of the delta here? Are you suggesting it should meet some kind of standard?
How does one compensate? How does anyone, content authors or otherwise, compensate for the fact that you have simply changed what the confidentiality and privacy properties are of the transport? What does that mean to compensate for that?
We're obviously not going to rewrite the whole charter sitting here, but we'll take as many comments as we can before we get to the questions, which I would say is on the order of 3 or 4 more minutes.
Mallory Nodal, Article 19. So we keep referring to content authors, and I don't think that's what you mean in all cases. And actually, the better word would be publishers. We're talking about online versions of newspapers and other places that are no longer going to, for example, get their own ad revenue because of something like this. And that would probably be a little bit more accurate. And then I think there also might need to be a little bit of thinking around the goals for that third person, like stakeholder, if you will, like how this will affect those original content publishers. I had another point. Oh, I think in the last one around centralization and power imbalances, maybe also doesn't completely encapsulate how this will look for a publisher, a content publisher, because I think it is also around monetization, and power and centralization don't quite get at that explicitly. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. So we still got.
So, oh wow, it just jumps around all the time. It's great.
I love it.
So, Martin Thompson.
We're going to cut the queue after.
Okay. So one of the things that's missing here, I think, is a very clear articulation of the constraints under which people choosing to use this would have to operate in order to gain the guarantees being promised. I kind of agree with DKG here that because we're making such a fundamental change to the way this operates, setting the bar here is unrealistic. So we need, what we're doing here is we're setting a new bar, and in order to meet that new bar, you have to meet an entirely new set of requirements. And that goes to Mark's question about how you operationalize this thing. It goes to the question of that Jeffrey raised in his discussion about what sort of confidentiality guarantees we need to expect. And it goes to things like the personalization things. You can't put personalized information in one of these things and get anywhere near the guarantees that we're talking about here. So I'd like to see that somewhere in this charter explicitly, because there's going to be some work to set the bar and do the analysis to prove that we can meet that bar and find what constraints need to be met in order to reach that bar. So I realize it's a bit of a mouthful and handful to get rid of, but I think that's really central to all of this. And if you've got that, I've got another point.
Yes.
We're running short on time.
We're running short on time, but go ahead.
I don't think safe web app installation is necessarily a goal that I'm interested in pursuing. I know that others are, but I think there's a lot wrapped up in that could lead to some very interesting consequences for a working group and disagreements unless we unpack that a lot more. I suspect that we're going to put ourselves into a tailspin. And just addressing something like the AMP use case or the distribute content to someone who has narrow backhaul, as we heard earlier, maybe we could solve those two, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. So I'd rather avoid that.
Roberto Pay on Facebook. I would not love to be sued for participating in this as a private individual because somebody did not put a license on this thing but suggested it can be distributed. I think that we would be remiss if we did not consider that aspect of redistribution in here somewhere.
Okay. Ben?
Hi, Ben Schwartz. So I wanted to sort of second Martin's point that and particularly I wanted to point out that there's this line here about out of scope. It's out of scope to define the details of how web browsers load the formats. I think it would be worth rephrasing that, because I think it should be in scope to define constraints on how web browsers load the format. In particular, I want to point out that there are some constraints that would make this a clear privacy victory over existing HTTPS. In particular, if there's a constraint that web browsers can't load a bundle in response to a user action, that it can only be essentially pushed down by the server preemptively. That actually, I expect personally, has better privacy properties than ordinary HTTPS. And so I think the charter should make it clear that it's at least allowable for the working group to create a constraint of that kind.
Thank you. Please be brief.
Felix Hanta, Facebook. I think one of the things that stands out to me here is something that is not discussed in the scope and sort of united the use cases that were discussed is a sort of punting on the discovery mechanism. All of these cases, to my knowledge, described sort of manual user discovery of this, and maybe that's a hard problem, but I think this is the best place to look at solving that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go on. So the packaging format will also aim to achieve the secondary goals described in draft UmpySquat, as long as they don't compromise or delay the above properties. The following potential goals are out of scope for this charter. DRM, a way to distribute the private portions of a website. For example, WPACK might define a way to distribute Gmail's application, but won't define a way to distribute individual emails without a direct connection to Gmail's origin. We talked about the next one, but defining the details of how a web browser load the formats and interact with any protocols we define here. A way to automatically discover the URL for an accessible package that includes specific content. Note that consensus is required both for changes to the current protocol mechanisms and retention of current mechanisms. In particular, because something is in the initial document set, there's that list there, does not imply that this consensus around features of how to specify it. That's basically just saying it's a starting point and we're going to take control and do whatever we want to the document, which is pretty standard. Relationships to other SDOs, WPACK will work with the W3C and the WHAT working group to identify the existing security and privacy models for the web and to ensure those SDOs can define how this format is used by web browsers. Yes. Yes.
The private information stuff, I can understand. I can guess as to why that's out of scope. Why are we making that out of scope? Because it can actually increase security in some cases.
So in order to distribute private information, you do need to encrypt it. It's very dangerous to sign it in a way that anyone will trust is coming from the origin server. There's spoofing attacks. So like making this for public information constrains the scope to make it tractable.
So why don't we say that then instead of that?
So this question could go on for a long time. So unfortunately, the constraints of the format, we're going to move forward, I think, to the polls based on what we know and we understand about how the group feels about the changes to the charter. We obviously can't present a totally revised charter, in real time. So we'll do our best based upon these questions.
So BOF polls, we have them here. You've read them all. We can actually wordsmith them on the fly, but I hope we don't have to. Do you understand the issue being proposed for the working group? Please home now. Do you not understand the issues being proposed for the working group? Please home now. That was pretty clear. Next, 1A. Is it well enough defined for a working group? Please hum now. Is it not well enough defined for a working group? I guess we should be calling these out. That I think the first one was very clear. Second one, I thought it was slightly more for yes.
Probably 2 to 1.
2 to 1. Yeah, obviously. Yeah, I mean, of course. Yeah, we're not done. That we're, this is assuming that we get the charter revisions done and agreed essentially. 2, is this a problem that should be addressed by the IETF? Please hum now. Is this a problem statement that should not be addressed by the IETF now? That was pretty clear for the yes. Are there enough people willing to work on the problem? Please hum now, if you're willing. If you're not willing to participate in the work, please hum now.
This is contractual.
No, the obverse is if you're willing to block people from working on the problem, please hum now.
A significant number of people hummed that they were willing.
Yes.
Yeah, show of hands, who will work on documents, review them, and
third. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 20 people.
And a number of different organizations.
I'd say about 20-ish. From a number of organizations as well. So it's not just one. Are the proposed deliverables correct and well articulated? Please hum now.
Milk toast hum.
Milk toast hum. I mean, I think that drives from us trying to figure out the charter. So, I mean, one falls from the other. So I think we're going to get another lukewarm one here. Are the proposed deliverables not correct and not well articulated? Or correct.
Hum the contrappost.
Yes. So I think we're. Oh, sorry. So are the proposed deliverables not correct or not well articulated? Please hum now. Okay. Yeah, I'd say that was 50-50. Alexi, do you have the information that you need as the sponsoring AD? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, obviously, the next steps are to revise the charter, and basically work out the details. But it didn't sound from where I was sitting that this was a go away, burn in hell. This was the end of the world. Right?
Clarification: that charter revision is going to happen on the mailing list in public.
Yes. I mean, there was a GitHub repo, but yeah, the whole idea is that we can do it all in the public, and it won't be me. So cool. Thank you very much for your time. Where are the blue sheets? I see one. Where's the other one? At this point, Mark Wilson. I mean, the funny part is if this group is not quiet, let's go away and burn it down. That's a big chunk of work. As you welcome, I don't know, maybe 9 months. Yeah. So the thing is, like,
Jeffrey, I have a question.
Thank you very much. Do you want a piece of chocolate too?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. These were bribery gifts.
Well, my bar is set a bit higher than piece of chocolate. So that's another one. Well, it's funny. I mean. Well, you can make it.